Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you become a literary expert. So if you're a regular viewer of my channel, you know that I've done lots of close reading and deep dive analysis on the play Macbeth, which is a text that many of you will be studying at school. But recently I ran into a bit of a rut in terms of ideas to talk about. So I was just thinking, what should I do to re-oil my inspiration engines? So my solution was actually to go and watch a theatrical performance of the play at the Southwark Playhouse theatre in Borough, London. So the show was performed by the Flabbergast Theatre, which is a talented London-based drama troupe formed in 2010 with a diverse cast, both in terms of background and their skills. With their adaptation of Macbeth, they've used a creative combination of bouton dance, which is a form of Japanese dance theatre where actors are covered in white body paint, slapstick comedy, choral drumming, etc. All of which made for a feast on the senses, to say the least. So one point to note about the venue is that the Southwark Playhouse is designed as a theatre in the round, which means that the performance takes place in the center of the venue, enclosed by audience members from all four sides without any elevated stage. So unlike theatres with a much grander, more extravagant setup, this sort of theatre in the round arrangement removes any sense of hierarchy and makes for a much more intimate experience for the viewer, which I thought was quite interesting given that the central theme of Macbeth is kingship and power. But it's also actually appropriate with the deep psychological exploration that's so necessary in our engagement with Shakespeare's agonizing, tragic hero. As with the case of theatrical or cinematic adaptations, the director almost always takes some sort of creative liberties in their reinterpretation of the play. Depending on how faithful they are to the original text, the production could range from being a traditional dramatization to a modern-day reimagination of the play, with removals of lines, additions of props, recontextualization of setting, etc., all being part of the arsenal of dramatic adaptation. In terms of the plotline and speeches, though, the Southwark Playhouse production doesn't really diverge too much from Shakespeare's text, but I thought that there were several elements that the Flabbergast troupe had added and amplified, which I found interesting and meaningful to point out, largely because all of this got me looking at the play with a fresh perspective, and to consider frames of reference that I had previously overlooked or not really thought about at all. So if you're studying the play, my observations will be helpful for you to think about how Macbeth could come across differently through the page versus the stage, even if you haven't watched this particular adaptation. And we know that by now, any top grade Shakespeare student should make an effort to show their awareness of the play as performance first and text second. So sit tight and let's draw the curtains for my first observation. One of the most striking things I remember about the production is the use of slapstick. In Shakespeare's script, the only moment of comic relief comes at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3, with the porter's sinister knock-knock jokes about how different personalities on Earth will all eventually have to arrive and knock at the gates of hell. But in the Southwark production, this moment is instead replaced with a slapstick actor who speaks virtually no lines. Instead, this actor gestures clownishly at various audience members in an attempt to invite laughter after what's otherwise an emotionally heavy scene of violent regicide, which is, of course, after Macbeth kills Duncan. At one point, this slapstick actor whisks out a small apple from his trouser pocket with a cheeky grin, and he goes on to juggle it for more light-hearted entertainment. Now, this is, of course, absent from the original text, and if we consider what the apple often symbolizes in Western and often Christological culture, being the notorious forbidden fruit in the book of Genesis, then there's a strong association of the idea of the original sin with Macbeth's regicidal crime. Given that Adam was tempted by Eve to taste the fruit, the husband and wife partner in crime parallel becomes all the more apt. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. It's interesting as well to think about Macbeth's murder of Duncan in light of the original sin concept, because this suggests an anti-free will reading of the play, i.e., as Macbeth is by nature a fallen man, he must eventually sin, and his sin simply manifests in the form of a power-grabbing regicide. He has no choice but to give in to his sinful impulses. It also reinforces the play's Christian worldview, which is borne out in the recurrent allusions to heaven and hell, as well as to God's judgment from above. This is contextually appropriate as well, because Shakespeare would have almost certainly wanted the Christian influence to prevail over that of supernatural witchcraft, with the Protestant Wiccaphobic James as his king and patron. By now I've lost track of the number of times I've read Macbeth, largely to create content for this channel. But until watching the Southwark production, I don't think I've ever looked at the couple's marriage as one that's charged with too much sexual energy or playfulness. I always got the impression that Macbeth was a bit terrified by his wife, and coupled with his own insecurities about his masculinity, Macbeth ends up being motivated to kill Duncan, largely out of a desire to pacify his wife, and also to prove her emasculating views wrong. His fear of Lady Macbeth is reinforced after he exclaims, in response to her staunch conviction that they won't fail in their coup against Duncan, she should bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted mettle should compose nothing but males. Which is obviously ironic because it's the female character here who demonstrates much more mettle than the male. Prior to watching the Southwark production, I'd always imagined an actor playing Macbeth to say this in a somewhat intimidated way, perhaps looking aghast or shocked, even outraged. But the Flabbergast Macbeth, who is played by the energetic Henry Maynard, who is the lead actor in the troupe, delivers these lines in a teasing tone as he scoops up his wife in one excited swoop and spanks her on the bottom with sexual playfulness. And this air of sexual frisson dominates the Macbeth's chemistry in this production, which has actually completely changed the way I see the couple's dynamics. Contrary to my long-standing perception of Macbeth as this slightly terrified but also indignant and affectionate husband to a possibly sexually frustrated wife, Flabbergast's production of this tragic hero turns him into a virile, sensual man who perhaps sees fulfilling his wife's pleasure as a priority, and one that even supersedes achieving political ambition or power. In fact, up until this production's Macbeth actually does the deed, he comes across very much like this avuncular chap at the pub, who's this pudgy middle-aged man who's a bit awkward, but also largely harmless. But what is clear in this dramatization is just how much he adores his wife, which is quite obviously portrayed in the close bodily contact between the actor and the actress. So I wonder then if the Southwark production doesn't cast Macbeth in an even more sympathetic light than the original, as this gormless husband who just wants too desperately to make his ever dissatisfied and easily bored wife happy, as he realizes only too late that killing the king isn't actually part of this imaginary sexual roleplay, but a serious action with real tragic consequences that once done can never be undone. Now, my final observation about this production is the use of heavy, constant choral drumming throughout the performance. Now, on the whole, this Southwark production is a rather loud one, and this audibility extends beyond the scenes in which the witches appear, which would make sense to be loud, as these noisier moments with the three characters' constant chanting and shrieking. But even at points when Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are delivering their soliloquies, which are supposed to be quieter scenes, the Flabbergast cast would thump these long wooden sticks against the floorboards or strike at these timpani drums to create an impactful soundscape. This seems to externalize the heart palpitations of the characters, the strength and regularities of which would make sense given the increasing guilt and anxiety that the characters feel after murdering the king. So I thought this use of sound acoustics was a simple but smart and effective way of amplifying the character's psyche. Now, having said that, I felt that the singular emphasis on drums and thumping sounds was perhaps a bit too much for my taste. There were barely any moments of silence or pauses in the production, which I felt were necessary. Even during those moments when Macbeth is in his more pensive, philosophical state, like in his Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow lament about his wife's death and the fleeting nature of existence, or when Lady Macbeth agonizes over the imaginary damned spot on her hand in the sleepwalking scene, the kind of muted and eerie quietude that I get from reading Shakespeare's original is lost. With the whole production being so consistently loud from the beginning to the end, I felt like the lack of sonic contrast between noise and silence somewhat takes away the emotional poignancy that the performance could otherwise have evoked in the audience. But of course, that's just my personal taste and preferences. And if you were to watch the play, perhaps you'll get a completely different vibe and impression. And there you have it, guys. Just the 3 things that most stood out to me when I watched the Southwark Productions Macbeth in Borough, London. With any theatrical performance you see, it's always a good idea to consider how a play is brought alive or even sometimes made less by the use of dramatic props, sound effects, music, and creative interpretation, etc. Because that's going to make your understanding of the play that much richer. In any case, the Southwark Playhouse in London is a wonderful, cozy venue for both theatre buffs and general playgoers to enjoy a more intimate theatrical experience. So if you're ever in London or you manage to catch one of Flabbergast's production, I would highly recommend that you check them out. I will link their website in the description box below so you can follow them for any of their future dates and performances. Check out my extensive Macbeth playlist, which I'll link to in the description box below, which will help you massively in your studies of the play. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button below so that you can encourage me to keep making these useful English Lit study videos. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of my weekly videos going forward. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!